Our story begins far back in the mists of time, long before Frisian and English emerged as distinct languages, in an era when the people of Northern Europe spoke a language that we now refer to as Proto-Germanic. This language is the common ancestor of all Germanic languages, including not just Frisian and English, but also Dutch, German, the Scandinavian languages, and others. To truly understand where Frisian and English come from, we must first explore the roots of Proto-Germanic, its speakers, and how this ancient language laid the groundwork for the tongues we speak today. The Proto-Germanic language likely began to take shape around 500 BCE, though its roots stretch back even further into the depths of the Indo-European language family. Indo-European itself was a prehistoric language spoken by a people living in the steppes of what is now southern Russia and Ukraine. Over thousands of years, this language spread across Europe and Asia, splintering into various branches as different groups of speakers migrated and settled in new lands. As these Indo-European-speaking groups moved into what we now call Northern Europe, their language began to evolve in unique ways. The Proto-Germanic language developed as these early settlers adapted their speech to fit their new environment, their changing lifestyles, and their interactions with neighboring peoples. We can imagine small, tight-knit communities living in scattered villages across the dense forests and marshy coastlines of what is now Germany, Denmark, and the Netherlands. These early Germanic tribes were farmers, fishermen, and warriors, leading lives that were heavily influenced by the natural world around them. Proto-Germanic was a language that suited these people's needs perfectly. It was robust and flexible, with a strong system of consonants and vowels that allowed for a wide variety of sounds. The language had a relatively simple structure, with clear, straightforward grammar that made it easy to form new words as needed. This was essential in a world where the environment was constantly changing, where new tools and technologies were being developed, and where contact with other groups could bring new ideas, objects, and customs. One of the most important features of Proto-Germanic was its system of strong and weak verbs, a characteristic that would be passed down to all its descendant languages, including Frisian and English. Strong verbs were those that formed their past tense by changing the vowel in the stem of the word, a pattern still visible in modern English verbs like sing, sang, sung, or drive, drove, driven. Weak verbs, on the other hand, formed their past tense by adding a suffix, much like walk, walked, or talk, talked, in modern English. This distinction between strong and weak verbs added a level of flexibility and nuance to the language, allowing speakers to express different shades of meaning with ease. The speakers of Proto-Germanic were not isolated. They interacted with other Indo-European peoples, including the Celts to the west and the Balts and Slavs to the east. These interactions, whether through trade, warfare, or migration, influenced the development of the language. For example, Proto-Germanic borrowed words from Celtic languages, especially in areas related to warfare and agriculture, reflecting the importance of these activities in the daily lives of the people. Around 500 BCE, the Proto-Germanic tribes began to spread out across Northern Europe. Some moved into what is now Scandinavia, others into the British Isles, and still others into the lowlands of what is now the Netherlands and Germany. As these groups migrated and settled in new regions, their language began to change. Dialects started to form, each influenced by the specific needs and experiences of its speakers. These early dialects are the precursors to the various Germanic languages that would eventually emerge, including Frisian and English. The climate and geography of Northern Europe played a significant role in shaping these dialects. The dense forests, cold winters, and rugged coastlines of Scandinavia, for example, favored a more isolated way of life. This isolation led to the development of distinct Scandinavian dialects, which would later evolve into languages like Swedish, Danish, and Norwegian. In contrast, the more temperate and open lands of what is now Germany and the Netherlands allowed for greater interaction between groups, leading to a more fluid and dynamic linguistic environment. One of the key regions in our story is the coastal area of what is now the Netherlands and northwestern Germany. This region, with its low-lying lands, marshes, and rivers, was home to a group of tribes that spoke a dialect of Proto-Germanic that would eventually evolve into Old Frisian. These tribes were seafarers and traders, living in small villages along the coast and engaging in trade with other Germanic tribes, as well as with the Celtic peoples to the west and the Romans to the south. The language spoken by these early Frisiae, as they were known, was closely related to the dialects spoken by other Germanic tribes, particularly those who would later migrate to Britain and become the Anglo-Saxons. The proximity of the Frisiae to these other tribes meant that there was a great deal of linguistic exchange between them. This exchange helped to keep the dialects of these groups relatively similar, even as they began to diverge from the original Proto-Germanic language. Meanwhile, the tribes in what is now Denmark and northern Germany, who would later migrate to Britain, were developing their own dialects. These dialects shared many features with the language of the Frisiae, but there were also important differences. For example, the dialects spoken by the future Anglo-Saxons were influenced by their contact with the Scandinavian tribes to the north, leading to certain phonetic and grammatical changes that would distinguish Old English from Old Frisian. As we reach the end of this chapter, we see the early stages of a linguistic divergence that would eventually lead to the development of two distinct languages, Frisian and English. At this point in time, however, the languages were still very much in their infancy. The people who spoke these early dialects lived in small, interconnected communities, their lives shaped by the land and sea, by their interactions with other tribes, and by the challenges and opportunities of their environment. As we move forward in time, the world of the early Germanic tribes began to change dramatically. The period from roughly 300 CE to 600 CE, known as the Migration Period or the Völkerwanderung, was a time of significant upheaval across Europe. The Roman Empire, which had long been the dominant power in the region, was in decline, and various Germanic tribes were on the move, seeking new lands and opportunities. It was during this period that the ancestors of the Frisian and English-speaking peoples began to lay down the roots of their future languages, Old Frisian and Old English. The migration period was driven by a complex web of factors. Climate changes, population pressures, and the weakening of Roman authority all contributed to the movement of tribes. Among these tribes were the Angles, Saxons, and Jutes, who hailed from what is now Denmark and northern Germany. These tribes began migrating across the North Sea to the British Isles, where they would eventually establish the foundations of what would become England and the English language. The reasons for this migration are varied. Some of these tribes were likely pushed out of their homelands by pressure from other groups, such as the Huns, who were moving westward from the steppes of Central Asia. Others may have been drawn by the promise of new lands in Britain, which had been largely abandoned by the Romans by the early 5th century. The collapse of Roman authority in Britain created a power vacuum that the Anglo-Saxons were quick to fill. These migrations did not happen all at once but over several decades. The Anglo-Saxons, as they would come to be known, landed in different parts of Britain, establishing small kingdoms that would eventually coalesce into larger political entities. The dialects they brought with them began to evolve into what we now call Old English. But at this early stage, these dialects were still very similar to the ones spoken by their kinfolk who remained on the continent, including those who would become the Frisians. Meanwhile, on the other side of the North Sea, the people who would come to be known as the Frisians were also undergoing significant changes. The coastal regions of what is now the Netherlands and northwestern Germany were becoming more densely populated, and the Frisian people were establishing themselves as skilled traders and seafarers. The Frisiae, as they were known in Roman times, were mentioned by Roman historians as early as the 1st century CE, but by the migration period, they were beginning to emerge as a distinct cultural and linguistic group. The Frisian lands were strategically located along the coast, with easy access to both the North Sea and the rivers that flowed inland. This made them ideally situated to engage in trade with other Germanic tribes, as well as with the remnants of the Roman Empire to the south and the Anglo-Saxons across the sea. The Frisians became known as the truckers of the North Sea, transporting goods like salt, fish, and grain, as well as more luxurious items like amber and textiles. As the Frisians became more involved in trade, their language began to reflect these interactions. They borrowed words from Latin, the language of the Roman world, as well as from other Germanic languages. This linguistic exchange helped to shape the early form of Old Frisian, which was still very similar to the dialects spoken by the Anglo-Saxons in Britain but was beginning to develop its own unique features. The relationship between the early Frisian and Anglo-Saxon peoples was close, not just linguistically but also culturally and politically. They shared many of the same customs, religious beliefs, and social structures. Both groups were organized into tribal societies, with power held by local chieftains or kings who ruled over small territories. These leaders were often chosen for their military prowess, as both the Frisians and the Anglo-Saxons were warrior societies, constantly defending their lands from rivals and seeking to expand their influence. Religion played a central role in the lives of both the Frisians and the Anglo-Saxons. Before the arrival of Christianity, they practiced a form of Germanic paganism, worshipping gods like Woden, Odin, Thunor, Thor, and Tyr. These gods were seen as powerful forces who controlled the natural world and could offer protection in battle. Religious practices included sacrifices, feasts, and the veneration of sacred sites, such as groves of trees or springs. By the late 6th century, the Frisians and the Anglo-Saxons were starting to be drawn into the orbit of the expanding Christian world. Missionaries from the Frankish kingdom, which lay to the south of Frisian territory, began to make inroads into both Frisian and Anglo-Saxon lands. The conversion of the Anglo-Saxons to Christianity was a relatively rapid process, beginning with the mission of St. Augustine of Canterbury in 597 CE. By the early 7th century, most of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms had adopted Christianity, and this new faith began to have a profound impact on their language and culture. For the Frisians, the process of Christianization was slower and more contested. The Frisians were fiercely independent, and their chieftains resisted the efforts of the Frankish kings to impose their authority and their religion. It wasn't until the 8th century, with the missionary work of Saint Willibrord and Saint Boniface, that Christianity began to take hold in Frisian territory. The introduction of Christianity brought with it Latin literacy, which had a lasting impact on the Frisian language, just as it had on Old English. During the migration period, the close relationship between the Frisians and the Anglo-Saxons began to diverge as the two groups settled into their respective territories. The Anglo-Saxons in Britain were increasingly influenced by their new environment and by contact with the native Celtic populations, while the Frisians continued to be shaped by their interactions with their Germanic neighbors and the Franks. Despite these differences, the languages of the two groups remained remarkably similar, sharing a common grammatical structure and a large vocabulary. The migration period set the stage for the development of Old Frisian and Old English as distinct languages, but at this point, they were still close relatives, much like two branches growing from the same tree. The seeds had been planted, but the full flowering of these languages was still to come. As we move forward in time, the world of the early Germanic tribes began to change dramatically. The period from roughly 300 CE to 600 CE, known as the Migration Period or the Völkerwanderung, was a time of significant upheaval across Europe. The Roman Empire, which had long been the dominant power in the region, was in decline, and various Germanic tribes were on the move, seeking new lands and opportunities. It was during this period that the ancestors of the Frisian and English-speaking peoples began to lay down the roots of their future languages, Old Frisian and Old English. The migration period was driven by a complex web of factors. Climate changes, population pressures, and the weakening of Roman authority all contributed to the movement of tribes. Among these tribes were the Angles, Saxons, and Jutes, who hailed from what is now Denmark and northern Germany. These tribes began migrating across the North Sea to the British Isles, where they would eventually establish the foundations of what would become England and the English language. The reasons for this migration are varied. Some of these tribes were likely pushed out of their homelands by pressure from other groups, such as the Huns, who were moving westward from the steppes of Central Asia. Others may have been drawn by the promise of new lands in Britain, which had been largely abandoned by the Romans by the early 5th century. The collapse of Roman authority in Britain created a power vacuum that the Anglo-Saxons were quick to fill. These migrations did not happen all at once but over several decades. The Anglo-Saxons, as they would come to be known, landed in different parts of Britain, establishing small kingdoms that would eventually coalesce into larger political entities. The dialects they brought with them began to evolve into what we now call Old English. But at this early stage, these dialects were still very similar to the ones spoken by their kinfolk who remained on the continent, including those who would become the Frisians. Meanwhile, on the other side of the North Sea, the people who would come to be known as the Frisians were also undergoing significant changes. The coastal regions of what is now the Netherlands and northwestern Germany were becoming more densely populated, and the Frisian people were establishing themselves as skilled traders and seafarers. The Frisii, as they were known in Roman times, were mentioned by Roman historians as early as the 1st century CE, but by the migration period, they were beginning to emerge as a distinct cultural and linguistic group. The Frisian lands were strategically located along the coast, with easy access to both the North Sea and the rivers that flowed inland. This made them ideally situated to engage in trade with other Germanic tribes, as well as with the remnants of the Roman Empire to the south and the Anglo-Saxons across the sea. The Frisians became known as the truckers of the North Sea, transporting goods like salt, fish, and grain, as well as more luxurious items like amber and textiles. As the Frisians became more involved in trade, their language began to reflect these interactions. They borrowed words from Latin, the language of the Roman world, as well as from other Germanic languages. This linguistic exchange helped to shape the early form of Old Frisian, which was still very similar to the dialects spoken by the Anglo-Saxons in Britain but was beginning to develop its own unique features. The relationship between the early Frisian and Anglo-Saxon peoples was close, not just linguistically but also culturally and politically. They shared many of the same customs, religious beliefs, and social structures. Both groups were organized into tribal societies, with power held by local chieftains or kings who ruled over small territories. These leaders were often chosen for their military prowess, as both the Frisians and the Anglo-Saxons were warrior societies, constantly defending their lands from rivals and seeking to expand their influence. Religion played a central role in the lives of both the Frisians and the Anglo-Saxons. Before the arrival of Christianity, they practiced a form of Germanic paganism, worshipping gods like Woden, Odin, Thunor, Thor, and Tyr. These gods were seen as powerful forces who controlled the natural world and could offer protection in battle. Religious practices included sacrifices, feasts, and the veneration of sacred sites, such as groves of trees or springs. By the late 6th century, the Frisians and the Anglo-Saxons were starting to be drawn into the orbit of the expanding Christian world. Missionaries from the Frankish kingdom, which lay to the south of Frisian territory, began to make inroads into both Frisian and Anglo-Saxon lands. The conversion of the Anglo-Saxons to Christianity was a relatively rapid process, beginning with the mission of St. Augustine of Canterbury in 597 CE. By the early 7th century, most of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms had adopted Christianity, and this new faith began to have a profound impact on their language and culture. For the Frisians, the process of Christianization was slower and more contested. The Frisians were fiercely independent, and their chieftains resisted the efforts of the Frankish kings to impose their authority and their religion. It wasn't until the 8th century, with the missionary work of St. Willibrord and St. Boniface, that Christianity began to take hold in Frisian territory. The introduction of Christianity brought with it Latin literacy, which had a lasting impact on the Frisian language, just as it had on Old English. During the migration period, the close relationship between the Frisians and the Anglo-Saxons began to diverge as the two groups settled into their respective territories. The Anglo-Saxons in Britain were increasingly influenced by their new environment and by contact with the native Celtic populations, while the Frisians continued to be shaped by their interactions with their Germanic neighbors and the Franks. Despite these differences, the languages of the two groups remained remarkably similar, sharing a common grammatical structure and a large vocabulary. The migration period set the stage for the development of Old Frisian and Old English as distinct languages, but at this point, they were still close relatives, much like two branches growing from the same tree. The seeds had been planted, but the full flowering of these languages was still to come. As we move into the early medieval period, roughly from the 6th to the 10th centuries, the distinct identities of the Frisian and Anglo-Saxon peoples began to solidify, and with them, their languages Old Frisian and Old English started to take shape. This period is marked by the establishment of more permanent settlements, the development of political structures, and the increasing influence of Christianity, all of which played a crucial role in the evolution of these languages. In this chapter, we'll dive deep into how Old Frisian and Old English developed during this time, focusing on their similarities, differences, and the influences that shaped them. By the 6th century, the Anglo-Saxons had established several kingdoms across what is now England. These included Wessex, Mercia, Northumbria, and Kent, among others. Each of these kingdoms had its own dialect of Old English, reflecting the different Germanic tribes that had settled in these regions. For example, the West Saxons in Wessex spoke a dialect that would later become the basis for much of Old English literature and written records. Old English, during this period, was still very much a Germanic language. It retained many of the features of Proto-Germanic, such as a system of strong and weak verbs, a complex system of noun declensions, and a vocabulary that was largely Germanic in origin. For instance, common words like signing, king, hus, house, and eor, earth, in Old English are direct descendants of Proto-Germanic words. At the same time, across the North Sea, the Frisians were also developing their own language, Old Frisian. The Frisians lived in a series of small, independent communities along the coast of what is now the Netherlands and northwestern Germany. Unlike the Anglo-Saxons, the Frisians did not establish large kingdoms but rather lived in a more decentralized society, with local chieftains holding power over small regions. Old Frisian was strikingly similar to Old English, to the point where they were almost mutually intelligible. This similarity was due to their common origins in Proto-Germanic and their shared cultural and linguistic heritage. For example, the Old English word ea, river, corresponds closely with the Old Frisian a, and the word fisk, fish, is fisk in Old Frisian. The grammatical structures of the two languages were also very similar, with both using a system of inflected endings to indicate case, number, and gender in nouns, pronouns, and adjectives. However, as these languages began to develop independently, subtle differences started to emerge. One of the key factors in this divergence was the different external influences that each language was subjected to. In England, the Anglo-Saxons came into contact with the Celtic peoples who still inhabited parts of Britain. While the influence of Celtic languages on Old English was relatively minor, it did introduce some new vocabulary, especially in place names. Words like coombe, a valley, and crag, a rocky hill, are examples of Celtic borrowings in Old English. Meanwhile, Old Frisian was influenced by its proximity to the Frankish kingdom and later the Holy Roman Empire. The Franks, who spoke a West Germanic language closely related to Old High German, exerted both political and linguistic influence over the Frisian territories. This influence is evident in the borrowing of words related to governance, law, and religion. For example, the Old Frisian word kenning, king, is borrowed from the Frankish cunning, reflecting the political and social structures of the time. The Christianization of the Anglo-Saxons and the Frisians during this period also had a profound impact on their languages. The arrival of Christian missionaries brought Latin into both regions, and with it, a host of new vocabulary related to the church, religion, and education. In Old English, words like munich, monk, priest, priest, and biskop, bishop, were borrowed directly from Latin. Similarly, Old Frisian adopted Latin terms such as stirka, church, prester, priest, and engel, angel. Latin also influenced the writing systems of Old English and Old Frisian. Before the arrival of Christianity, both languages were written in runes, a script used by various Germanic peoples. The runic alphabet, known as the Futhorc in Old English, was well suited to the sounds of Germanic languages but was limited in its ability to represent the new sounds and concepts introduced by Latin. As a result, the Latin alphabet gradually replaced the runic script, especially for religious and legal texts. This shift to the Latin alphabet had important implications for the standardization of both Old English and Old Frisian. As scribes began to write down these languages using Latin letters, they also began to codify spelling, grammar, and vocabulary, creating the first written records of these languages. In England, the earliest Old English texts, such as the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle and Beowulf, were written in the West Saxon dialect, which became the dominant written form of Old English. In Frisian territories, however, the process of writing and standardization was less centralized. The Frisians were more politically fragmented, and as a result, Old Frisian texts reflect a variety of regional dialects. Nonetheless, some of the earliest legal codes, such as the Lex Frisianum, were written in Old Frisian, providing valuable insights into the language and society of the time. The Viking Age, which began in the late 8th century, brought further changes to both Old English and Old Frisian. The Vikings, who came from Scandinavia, spoke Old Norse, a North Germanic language. Their raids and settlements in England and the Frisian coast introduced a new wave of linguistic influence. In England, the Danelaw, a region under Viking control, became a melting pot of Old English and Old Norse. This contact led to the borrowing of many Old Norse words into Old English, particularly in areas related to everyday life, law, and governance. Words like law from Old Norse lagu, sky from sky, and window from vindaga are all examples of this influence. In Frisian territories, the impact of Old Norse was less pronounced but still noticeable. The Vikings traded and occasionally settled in Frisian lands, leading to the adoption of some Norse vocabulary. However, the Frisians managed to maintain a stronger linguistic identity, partly due to their continued trade connections with other Germanic tribes and the Frankish Empire. As we reach the end of this chapter, we see how Old Frisian and Old English, though still closely related, began to chart their own courses. The influences of Christianity, Latin, and Old Norse played significant roles in shaping these languages, adding new layers of complexity to their grammar, vocabulary, and writing systems. Despite these changes, both languages retained their Germanic core, rooted in the shared heritage of their speakers. As we move into the 11th and 12th centuries, the linguistic landscapes of both England and the Frisian territories began to change dramatically. This period, often referred to as the High Middle Ages, was marked by significant political upheavals, cultural transformations, and social changes that profoundly influenced the development of both English and Frisian. In this chapter, we'll explore how Old English transitioned into Middle English and how Old Frisian began to evolve into Middle Frisian. We'll look at the key events, influences, and changes that shaped these languages during this transformative era. The most pivotal event in the history of the English language during this period was the Norman conquest of 1066. When William the Conqueror, the Duke of Normandy, defeated the English king Harold II at the Battle of Hastings, he not only took control of the English throne, but also initiated a profound linguistic shift. The Normans spoke Old Norman, a Romance language closely related to Old French, and they brought this language with them to England. For the next several centuries, Norman French became the language of the English court, the legal system, the church, and the ruling classes. English, which had been the dominant language in Anglo-Saxon England, was relegated to a lower status, spoken primarily by the common people. This created a linguistic divide in the country, with the upper classes speaking Norman French and the lower classes speaking various dialects of Old English. However, rather than leading to the extinction of English, this situation set the stage for its transformation. The Norman rulers and their descendants eventually began to adopt English, but the language they adopted was no longer the same Old English spoken before the conquest. Instead, it had absorbed a vast amount of vocabulary from Norman French, particularly in areas related to law, governance, art, and religion. Words like court, judge, jury, government, beauty, and religion are all examples of Norman French borrowings that became permanently embedded in English. This influx of French vocabulary, combined with other changes in grammar and syntax, led to the emergence of what we now call Middle English. Middle English retained much of its Germanic core, but it was now a hybrid language, enriched and complicated by its contact with French. The grammar of Middle English also began to simplify during this period. For example, the complex system of noun declensions that characterized Old English started to break down, leading to a more straightforward word order and a reduction in the number of cases used in everyday speech. The influence of Norman French on English was particularly strong in certain regions, especially in the south of England, where the Norman presence was most concentrated. However, in the north and west of England, where the Normans had less influence, Old English dialects remained more conservative. This regional variation is reflected in the literature of the time. For example, the Ormulum, a Middle English text written around 1200, is a religious work that shows the strong influence of Norman French in its vocabulary, while the Ancrene Wis, written around the same time, retains more of the Old English grammatical structure. As Middle English began to take shape in England, a parallel evolution was occurring across the North Sea in Frisian-speaking territories. The Frisians, who had maintained their linguistic independence throughout the early medieval period, were now facing increasing pressure from the expanding Duchy of Holland and the Holy Roman Empire. Dutch influence began to permeate Frisian society, particularly in the urban centers, where Dutch was increasingly used for trade, administration, and legal matters. Despite these pressures, Frisian remained the dominant language in rural areas and among the common people. The transition from Old Frisian to Middle Frisian was marked by gradual changes in pronunciation, grammar, and vocabulary. For example, the Old Frisian system of strong and weak verbs began to simplify, much like in English, and the use of inflected endings in nouns and adjectives started to decline. This simplification of grammar reflected broader social changes, as Frisian society became more interconnected with the surrounding regions and more influenced by the languages spoken there. One of the most significant influences on Middle Frisian was the increasing use of Dutch loanwords. As trade and political ties with Holland grew stronger, many Dutch words entered the Frisian language, particularly in areas related to commerce, governance, and religion. This process of borrowing was similar to what was happening in England with Norman French, though on a smaller scale. For example, the Middle Frisian word geschiedenis, meaning history, was borrowed from the Dutch geschiedenis, reflecting the growing influence of Dutch in Frisian intellectual life. During this period, Frisian also began to develop a distinct literary tradition, though it was more limited than that of English. The oldest surviving Frisian texts date from the 13th century and include legal documents, charters, and religious writings. These texts provide valuable insights into the language and culture of medieval Frisia, showing a society that was fiercely independent, proud of its traditions, and increasingly aware of the larger political and cultural forces at play in Europe. The Frisian legal codes, known as the Frisian Freedom, played a particularly important role in shaping the language. These legal texts were written in Middle Frisian and were used to govern the various Frisian territories. The legal language was formal and precise, helping to preserve certain archaic features of Old Frisian while also incorporating new Dutch terms. The Frisian Freedom itself was a unique political arrangement, granting the Frisians a degree of autonomy under the nominal authority of the Holy Roman Emperor, which allowed them to maintain their language and legal traditions even as Dutch influence grew. By the 14th and 15th centuries, both Middle English and Middle Frisian were well established as distinct languages, each with its own unique features and influences. In England, Middle English was becoming more standardized, thanks in part to the rise of London as the political and economic center of the country. The London dialect of Middle English, heavily influenced by Norman French, began to spread throughout England, particularly through the use of English in government documents and the growing importance of English literature. One of the most important works of Middle English literature from this period is Geoffrey Chaucer's The Canterbury Tales, written in the late 14th century. Chaucer's use of the London dialect helped to establish it as the standard form of English, and his works provide a rich snapshot of Middle English in its most developed form. The tales also reflect the linguistic diversity of England at the time, with characters from different regions speaking in their own dialects, showcasing the wide range of Middle English forms. In Friesland, the situation was different. Middle Frisian never achieved the same level of standardization as Middle English. The political fragmentation of Friesland, combined with the increasing dominance of Dutch in the cities, meant that Middle Frisian remained a largely spoken language, with fewer written records and less literary development. However, the Frisians continued to value their language as a key part of their cultural identity, and efforts were made to preserve it through the oral tradition, folk songs, and legal documents. As we conclude this chapter, we see that the transition from Old to Middle English and Frisian was a time of both continuity and change. Both languages retained their Germanic roots, but they were also heavily influenced by the new political realities, cultural exchanges, and linguistic contacts of the medieval period. Middle English, in particular, was transformed by the Norman conquest, becoming a richer and more flexible language that would eventually give rise to modern English. As we step into the 15th and 16th centuries, Europe was undergoing profound transformations that would deeply influence the development of languages across the continent. The Renaissance, a cultural and intellectual revival that began in Italy and spread across Europe, brought with it new ideas, new technologies, and a renewed interest in the classical past. For both English and Frisian, this period marked the beginning of their transformation into early modern languages, shaped by the forces of cultural change, political upheaval, and technological innovation. In England, the Renaissance was accompanied by a growing sense of national identity and a flourishing of literature, science, and the arts. The invention of the printing press by Johannes Gutenberg around 1440 was a revolutionary development that played a crucial role in the standardization and spread of the English language. Before the printing press, books were copied by hand, a laborious process that limited the number of texts available and led to significant regional variation in spelling and grammar. With the advent of printing, books could be produced more quickly, more accurately, and in greater numbers, allowing for the wider dissemination of written English. The first book printed in English was William Caxton's Requile of the Histories of Troy, published in 1473. Caxton, an English merchant and diplomat, established the first printing press in England and became a major figure in the development of early modern English. Caxton's printed works helped to standardize English spelling and grammar, particularly the London dialect, which was becoming the basis for the standard language. However, this was no easy task, as English spelling was highly inconsistent at the time. Caxton himself often had to choose between different spellings, sometimes even within the same text. During this period, English was also undergoing significant changes in pronunciation, a process known as the Great Vowel Shift. This was a major phonetic shift that affected the pronunciation of long vowels in English, moving them up in the mouth. For example, the Middle English pronunciation of bite, which would have sounded more like beat, shifted to the modern pronunciation we recognize today. The Great Vowel Shift did not occur uniformly across all regions, which contributed to the diversity of accents and dialects in England. The Renaissance was also a time of great literary achievement in England. The works of William Shakespeare, Christopher Marlowe, Edmund Spenser, and others not only enriched the English language with thousands of new words and expressions, but also helped to elevate English to a language of high culture and literature. Shakespeare alone is credited with coining or popularizing over 1,700 words, many of which we still use today, such as lonely, bedroom, and assassination. His plays and sonnets demonstrated the expressive potential of early modern English, with its blend of native Germanic words, Norman French borrowings, and newly coined terms. The Renaissance also brought with it a renewed interest in the classical languages of Latin and Greek, which had a significant impact on English vocabulary. Scholars and writers of the period frequently borrowed words from Latin and Greek to express new ideas or to add a touch of erudition to their works. This influx of classical vocabulary further expanded the English lexicon, making it one of the richest and most flexible languages in Europe. While English was rapidly evolving and spreading in England, the Frisian language was facing different challenges. By the 15th and 16th centuries, Frisian had become increasingly marginalized, particularly in the urban centers of Friesland where Dutch was becoming the dominant language. The growing influence of the Dutch Republic and the economic power of cities like Amsterdam and Rotterdam meant that Dutch was the language of trade, government, and education. Frisian, once the language of a proud and independent people, was increasingly confined to the rural areas and the lower classes. Despite these pressures, Frisian managed to survive and even develop in some ways during this period. The Renaissance reached Friesland, though its impact was more muted compared to its effect in England. The Frisian language continued to be used in local administration, legal documents, and religious contexts, particularly in the more isolated rural areas where Dutch influence was weaker. One of the most important literary figures of this period for the Frisian language was Gijsbert Japicx, 1603 to 1666, often considered the father of modern Frisian literature. Japicx was a schoolteacher, poet, and writer who lived in the town of Bolsward in Friesland. He wrote in Frisian at a time when the language was under significant pressure from Dutch, and his works are credited with helping to preserve and revitalize Frisian. Japicx's poetry, which included both religious and secular themes, demonstrated the beauty and expressiveness of the Frisian language, and his efforts laid the groundwork for the later Frisian literary tradition. Japex's work was part of a broader movement in Friesland to preserve the Frisian language and culture in the face of growing Dutch dominance. This movement, known as Frisian nationalism, sought to protect the unique identity of the Frisian people, their language, and their traditions. While the movement was not as strong or widespread as similar nationalist movements in other parts of Europe, it played a crucial role in ensuring the survival of the Frisian language. The Renaissance also brought religious change to Europe, which had a significant impact on both English and Frisian. The Protestant Reformation, initiated by figures like Martin Luther in Germany and John Calvin in Switzerland, led to the widespread adoption of Protestantism in England and parts of the Netherlands, including Friesland. The translation of the Bible into vernacular languages became a central tenet of the Reformation, leading to the creation of new religious texts in both English and Frisian. In England, William Tyndale's translation of the New Testament in 1526 was a landmark in the development of early modern English. Tyndale's translation, based on the original Greek and Hebrew texts, brought the Bible into the hands of ordinary English speakers and played a significant role in shaping the language. Tyndale's use of clear, direct language influenced later English translations, including the King James Bible of 1611, which remains one of the most widely read and influential works in the English language. In Friesland, the translation of religious texts into Frisian was more limited, but it still had a significant impact. The Frisian translation of the Bible, known as the Old-Frisk Bibelboek, Old Frisian Bible Book, was completed in 1640. This translation helped to standardize Frisian spelling and grammar and provided a model for later writers. However, the use of Frisian in religious contexts was increasingly overshadowed by Dutch, particularly as the Reformation led to greater centralization of church authority and the imposition of Dutch as the language of worship in many areas. The Reformation also led to the development of a new religious and political identity in England. The establishment of the Church of England under Henry VIII and the subsequent religious conflicts of the Tudor and Stuart periods contributed to the consolidation of English as the national language. The English Bible, the Book of Common Prayer, and other religious texts became central to English identity, reinforcing the status of English as the language of both the state and the church. As we enter the 17th and 18th centuries, the world was on the brink of unprecedented change. This period, often referred to as the Age of Exploration or the Age of Discovery, saw European powers embarking on voyages across the globe in search of new lands, trade routes, and resources. For the English language, this era marked the beginning of its transformation from a national language to a global one. Meanwhile, in Friesland, the Frisian language faced continued challenges as it navigated the complex political and social changes in Europe. In this chapter, we'll explore how English began to spread across the world and how Frisian managed to survive in its homeland. The roots of English's global spread can be traced back to the late 16th century, during the reign of Elizabeth I. England, though still a relatively small and isolated nation compared to the great powers of Spain and Portugal, began to establish itself as a significant maritime force. English explorers like Sir Francis Drake and Sir Walter Raleigh undertook voyages that expanded England's influence and opened new opportunities for trade and colonization. These early expeditions set the stage for England's involvement in the wider world, laying the groundwork for the establishment of English-speaking colonies. One of the first major English settlements overseas was the founding of Jamestown in 1607 in what is now Virginia, USA. This settlement marked the beginning of English colonization in North America, a process that would continue and expand over the next 2 centuries. The English language, carried by settlers, traders, and soldiers, began to take root in the New World. As more English colonies were established, particularly along the eastern seaboard of North America, the English language began to spread across the continent. The development of American English during this period is a fascinating story of adaptation and influence. The settlers who arrived in the New World came from different regions of England, bringing with them various English dialects. These dialects mixed and mingled in the new environment, leading to the development of distinctive American accents and vocabulary. For example, words like fall for autumn, trash for rubbish, and sidewalk for pavement reflect the unique evolution of English in America. Additionally, American English was influenced by contact with indigenous languages, as well as with other European languages like Dutch, French, and Spanish, all of which contributed new words and expressions. As English spread across North America, it also began to make inroads into other parts of the world. The establishment of the British East India Company in 1600 marked the beginning of English influence in Asia. The company, initially focused on trade, eventually became a powerful political and military force in India. English began to be used as a language of administration and education in British-controlled territories in India, laying the foundations for the widespread use of English in South Asia that continues to this day. In Africa, English spread through trade and colonization, particularly in regions like West Africa and Southern Africa. English was often used as a lingua franca in trade, especially along the coast where European ships docked and traded with local merchants. The spread of English in Africa was furthered by the establishment of colonies, such as in South Africa, where English became one of the dominant languages alongside Afrikaans and indigenous languages. The spread of English during the Age of Exploration was not just a matter of language. It was also a matter of culture, power, and identity. As English-speaking settlers, traders, and officials spread across the globe, they brought with them English literature, law, and social norms. The King James Bible, published in 1611, became a cornerstone of English-speaking communities, both in England and abroad, shaping religious practice and literacy. Similarly, English common law and legal principles were exported to the colonies, influencing the development of legal systems around the world. Back in Europe, while English was spreading across the globe, the Frisian language was facing a very different set of circumstances. Friesland, located in the northern Netherlands, was increasingly under the influence of the Dutch Republic. By the 17th century, Dutch had become the dominant language in urban areas, especially in trade, government, and education. Frisian, which had once been a vibrant and independent language, was now largely confined to rural areas and spoken primarily by farmers and fishermen. Despite these challenges, Frisian did not disappear. The language continued to be spoken by the Frisian people in their daily lives, and it remained a key part of their cultural identity. Frisian folk traditions, oral storytelling, and songs helped to keep the language alive, even as Dutch became more dominant. The resilience of the Frisian language during this period is a testament to the strong sense of identity and community among the Frisian people. The political landscape of Europe during the 17th and 18th centuries also had an impact on the Frisian language. The region of Friesland was caught up in the larger conflicts and power struggles that defined European politics at the time. The 80 Years' War, 1568 to 1648, which saw the Dutch Republic gain independence from Spain, led to the consolidation of Dutch power in Friesland. This further entrenched Dutch as the language of administration and governance, while Frisian continued to be the language of the common people. The Frisian language faced another challenge during this period from the increasing centralization of the Dutch state. The Dutch government promoted the use of Dutch as the national language, which put pressure on regional languages like Frisian. However, the Frisians were proud of their heritage and resisted attempts to completely assimilate into Dutch culture. This resistance took the form of continued use of Frisian in local government, churches, and schools, particularly in rural areas where Frisian identity was strongest. One of the key figures in the preservation of the Frisian language during this period was Johan van Hichtem, 1628 to 1703, a Frisian nobleman and poet who wrote in both Frisian and Dutch. Van Hichtem was part of a small but dedicated group of Frisian intellectuals who sought to preserve and promote the Frisian language and culture. His works, which included poetry and translations of classical literature into Frisian, helped to keep the language alive in a time of great change. By the late 18th century, the situation for Frisian was still difficult, but there were signs of a renewed interest in the language. The Romantic movement, which emphasized the importance of national identity and folk culture, began to influence Frisian intellectuals and writers. This period saw the beginning of a Frisian literary revival, with writers and poets turning to their native language as a way to express their cultural identity and resist the dominance of Dutch. As we move into the 19th and 20th centuries, both Frisian and English underwent significant transformations, though in very different contexts. This period was marked by industrialization, the rise of nationalism, and major social and political changes that reshaped the world. For English, this era solidified its status as a global language, while Frisian faced renewed challenges and opportunities as it sought to preserve its unique identity in a rapidly modernizing Europe. In this chapter, we'll explore these developments and begin to wrap up our detailed exploration of these two languages. The 19th century was a time of profound change across the world, driven by the forces of industrialization and colonial expansion. In Britain, the Industrial Revolution brought about rapid urbanization, technological innovation, and economic growth. This period also saw the British Empire reach the height of its power, with English spreading across vast territories in Asia, Africa, the Americas, and the Pacific. English became not just a language of trade and governance, but also of education, science, and literature. The expansion of English during this period was closely tied to Britain's colonial enterprises. In India, for example, English was established as the language of administration and higher education under British rule. The introduction of English medium schools and universities helped to create a class of English-speaking Indians who played crucial roles in the governance and modernization of the subcontinent. This laid the foundation for English to become one of the most important languages in India, a status it retains today. In Africa, English spread through colonization and missionary work. English-speaking missionaries established schools and churches across the continent, introducing the language to indigenous populations. In regions like Southern Africa, English became a key language of communication among different ethnic groups, as well as the language of the colonial administration. The legacy of English in Africa is complex, as it both facilitated communication and education, but also played a role in the suppression of indigenous languages and cultures. In North America, English continued to evolve as it spread westward across the continent. The United States, having gained independence from Britain in the late 18th century, became a powerful force in its own right during the 19th century. American English began to develop its own distinct characteristics, influenced by the diverse immigrant populations that settled in the country. The expansion of the American frontier and the growth of cities like New York, Chicago, and San Francisco helped to establish English as the dominant language across the continent. The rise of the United States as a global power in the 20th century further cemented the status of English as a global language. American cultural exports, including films, music, and literature, spread English around the world. The role of the United States in global politics, economics, and science also contributed to the widespread use of English as an international language of communication. While English was becoming a global language, the situation for Frisian was quite different. The 19th century saw the rise of Frisian nationalism, a movement that sought to preserve and promote the Frisian language and culture in the face of increasing Dutch influence. This period was marked by a renewed interest in Frisian history, literature, and folklore, as well as efforts to standardize and promote the Frisian language. One of the key figures in the Frisian revival was Peter Gels Troelstra, 1860 to 1930, a Frisian lawyer, politician, and writer. Troelstra was a leading advocate for the Frisian language and played a crucial role in the movement to promote Frisian education and literature. He believed that the Frisian language was an essential part of the region's identity and worked to ensure its place in schools, newspapers, and public life. The Frisian movement of the 19th century led to the establishment of Frisian cultural and literary societies, as well as the publication of Frisian language books and newspapers. This period also saw the first attempts to standardize Frisian spelling and grammar, laying the groundwork for the modern Frisian language. The movement was part of a broader trend of regional nationalism in Europe, where many ethnic groups sought to assert their identity in the face of centralizing national governments. The 20th century brought new challenges and opportunities for Frisian. The world wars and the subsequent changes in European politics had a significant impact on Friesland. During the Nazi occupation of the Netherlands in World War II, the Frisian language was suppressed, and many Frisian cultural institutions were shut down. However, the end of the war brought a renewed effort to revive the language and culture. In the post-war period, the Frisian language gained official recognition in the Netherlands. In 1956, Frisian was officially recognized as the second national language of the Netherlands, and efforts were made to promote its use in education, government, and media. The Frisk Academy, an institution dedicated to the study and promotion of the Frisian language and culture, was established in 1938 and played a key role in these efforts. Despite these advances, Frisian continued to face challenges. The dominance of Dutch, particularly in urban areas, meant that Frisian was often seen as a rural language, spoken primarily by older generations. However, efforts to promote Frisian in schools and through media have helped to keep the language alive. Today, Frisian is spoken by around 500,000 people, primarily in the province of Friesland, where it enjoys a strong cultural and linguistic presence. In contrast, English continued its rise as the global lingua franca. The latter half of the 20th century saw the spread of English further accelerated by the growth of the internet, international business, and global media. English became the dominant language of science, technology, diplomacy, and entertainment, influencing virtually every aspect of global communication. The English language has proven remarkably adaptable, absorbing influences from countless other languages and cultures. The diversity of English dialects around the world, from British, American, and Australian English to the varieties spoken in Africa, Asia, and the Caribbean, reflects the language's global reach and its ability to evolve and change. As we wrap up this chapter, we see how the 19th and 20th centuries brought both challenges and opportunities for Frisian and English. While English emerged as a global language, Frisian faced the ongoing challenge of maintaining its identity in a world dominated by larger languages. Yet, both languages have shown remarkable resilience, each in its own way reflecting the history, culture, and values of the people who speak them. As we enter the 21st century, the linguistic landscapes of Frisian and English continue to evolve, shaped by the forces of globalization, technology, and cultural change. Both languages have traveled long and winding paths, and today, they face unique challenges and opportunities. In this final chapter, we'll reflect on the current status of Frisian and English, explore the efforts being made to preserve and promote Frisian, and consider the future of these two languages in an increasingly interconnected world. The English language has undoubtedly become the most influential language in the world. It serves as the global lingua franca, used in international business, diplomacy, science, technology, and entertainment. English is spoken by over 1.5 billion people worldwide, either as a first language or as an additional language, and its influence shows no signs of waning. The spread of English has been driven by several factors, including the legacy of the British Empire, the global dominance of American culture and media, and the rise of the internet and digital communication. In many ways, English has become the language of global communication. Whether it's in multinational corporations, international organizations like the United Nations, or online platforms like social media, English is often the default language used to connect people from different linguistic backgrounds. This widespread use of English has led to the emergence of global English or world Englishes, varieties of English that are influenced by local languages and cultures but still retain a core of shared vocabulary and grammar. The adaptability of English has allowed it to thrive in diverse environments. From the urban centers of New York and London to the remote villages of India and Africa, English has been absorbed and adapted by speakers around the world. This adaptability has also led to the development of new dialects and creoles, each reflecting the unique linguistic and cultural contexts in which English is spoken. For example, Singlish in Singapore, Jamaican Patois, and Hinglish in India are all examples of how English has blended with local languages to create something new and vibrant. However, the global dominance of English is not without its challenges and controversies. As English spreads, there is a growing concern about the potential erosion of other languages and cultures. The increasing use of English in education, business, and media can sometimes lead to the marginalization of local languages, especially in multilingual societies where English is seen as a key to social and economic advancement. This has sparked debates about linguistic imperialism and the need to protect linguistic diversity in the face of globalization. In contrast to the global spread of English, the Frisian language remains a regional language with a much smaller number of speakers, primarily concentrated in the province of Friesland in the northern Netherlands. Frisian is spoken by around 500,000 people, and while it enjoys official recognition and support from the Dutch government, it faces ongoing challenges in maintaining its vitality in a world dominated by larger languages like Dutch and English. The 21st century has seen renewed efforts to preserve and promote the Frisian language. These efforts are part of a broader movement to protect regional and minority languages in Europe and around the world. In Friesland, the Frisian language is taught in schools, and there are Frisian language media, including newspapers, radio stations, and television programs. The Frisk Academy continues to play a crucial role in researching and promoting Frisian language and culture. Technology has also become an important tool in the preservation and promotion of Frisian. The rise of the internet and digital communication has opened up new opportunities for Frisian speakers to connect, share content, and promote their language. Social media platforms, online forums, and websites dedicated to Frisian culture have helped to create a sense of community among Frisian speakers, both in Friesland and in the diaspora. One of the key challenges facing Frisian today is the need to balance the preservation of the language with the realities of a bilingual society. Most Frisian speakers are also fluent in Dutch, and Dutch remains the dominant language in many aspects of public life, including education, government, and business. This has led to concerns about language shift, where younger generations may increasingly prefer to use Dutch over Frisian, especially in urban areas. To address these challenges, there have been efforts to integrate Frisian more fully into public life. For example, Frisian is now used in some government communications, and there are initiatives to promote the use of Frisian in business and tourism. The goal is to ensure that Frisian remains a living, vibrant language that is used in a wide range of contexts, not just in the home or in cultural settings. The future of Frisian, like that of any language, will depend on the choices made by its speakers. Language is ultimately a reflection of identity, culture, and community, and as long as there are people who value and use Frisian, it will continue to survive and thrive. The challenge is to ensure that Frisian remains relevant to the lives of its speakers in a rapidly changing world. As we look to the future, it's clear that both Frisian and English will continue to evolve. English will likely remain a dominant global language, but it will also continue to adapt and change, influenced by the diverse cultures and communities that use it. The rise of new technologies, including artificial intelligence and machine translation, may also have an impact on how English is used and understood around the world. For Frisian, the future may involve finding new ways to promote the language and ensure its survival in a multilingual world. This could include greater use of Frisian in digital spaces, continued efforts to integrate Frisian into public life, and fostering a strong sense of pride and identity among Frisian speakers. In conclusion, the histories of Frisian and English are stories of resilience, adaptation, and change. Both languages have deep roots in the past, but they have also been shaped by the forces of history, culture, and technology. As we move forward into the 21st century and beyond, these languages will continue to reflect the identities and aspirations of the people who speak them, adapting to new challenges and opportunities as they arise. This brings our exploration of the histories of Frisian and English to a close. We have traced their development from their shared origins in the Germanic tribes to their modern forms, each with its own unique journey. While English has become a global language, Frisian has remained a symbol of regional identity and cultural pride. Both languages remind us of the rich tapestry of human history and the enduring power of language to connect us to our past, present, and future.